Hey you guys, it's Jai here. Some of you might know me as Judge Banks in Discord or Kronos in game. Today I'm doing a little bit of a Firebrand tutorial. There's a couple people that I was talking to the other day who were interested in getting a bit more of a deep dive into Firebrand, how to play it. Firebrand is it's pretty much an essential class in the game right now, and on the day of writing this, May 5th, 2021, it is considered an essential part of the meta and will likely remain so even through the patch we get in the next 6 days or so. I'm going to be going over a lot of the basics of Firebrand, but I'll be first touching upon the trait lines that we use and the reasoning for them, the gear, and then we'll move on to weapon skills, utility skills, and then finally finish off on tomes. And then I'll give a couple examples of rotations you might be doing and kind of a few sort of tips I have for new Firebrand players. I will be hopefully adding a couple of timestamps after I post this, so that way people can navigate to the portions that they're kind of more confused about or want to kind of hear my opinions on. And we'll go from there. And if you have any other questions, feel free to PM me about them or talk to me in game. So, Firebrand. As I said before, Firebrand is pretty much an essential class. There's very few classes that don't have some sort of alternative. Technically, you could substitute out Scrappers for Healing Tempest, for example, and there's like all sorts of other alternatives. But Firebrand is kind of the crutch of your entire subgroup. Now, a couple of misconceptions that people have. Firebrands, while they are decent healers, are not meant to be the primary healers of your group. Your job as Firebrand is not first and foremost to keep everybody like super crazy healed. That's the job of another person to do. The Firebrand has its own very specific function and its own kind of priorities, and specifically those priorities are boon uptimes. The boons you're going to be focusing on the most are resistance and, even more importantly, stability. So the Firebrand's the primary source of stability in a subgroup, and their job is to make sure that everybody else stays alive because they're not getting CC, they're not getting pulled. So that's all on the Firebrand. Before anything, I'm going to go over gear and traits. So the gear you want to be running on Firebrand. As for your two weapon sets, you always want to be running staff on Firebrand. But for your second weapons, which we kind of our secondary weapon set, which we kind of consider the melee weapon set, you have two options. In both cases, you're using shield, but you can decide to either go axe shield or you can go mace shield. I'll go over the traits that kind of vary from one to the other, but as kind of a general sort of summary, mace is the more defensive heal-oriented option, whereas axe has a little bit more offensive utility. It has a pull on it, and it's pretty good for cleaving downs as well. As for the gear you're going to be running, you should ideally be running full minstrels. I understand that some people might have some difficulties getting minstrel's armor. My recommendations for getting it is to either get the stat selectable armor that you get from the reward tracks and skirmish chests. So you can get either the warlord armor or the desert armor from the desert armor reward track, or the triumphant armor from World vs. World, or you can get warlord armor from PvP as well. All of these work to help you get minstrel armor. You can also just buy it off the TP. It is pretty expensive, but that's always an option as well. And if all else fails, you can also go for the Giver's stat line instead, which gives a little bit less personal sustain, but you could run it as sort of a supplementary, but Minstrels is definitely the way to go. As for runes, you have two primary options that I consider the best options. You can supplement in whatever you want, but generally speaking, you want to either be running the superior runes of durability or the superior runes of the monk. The difference between these two is durability has much more of an emphasis on boon uptime. It disperses more boons to your group, and helps a little bit with personal sustain. Monk can be a good option if you're constantly finding you're lacking healers in your subgroup. Monk runes work for giving extra heals, and that's their kind of their big thing. So you can either get the Monk's runes from doing the Ascalonian Catacombs or doing the Ascalonian Catacombs reward track and getting tokens from that and using those at a dungeon vendor. Or in the case of the superior runes of the durability, which is what I run, you can go to the heroics merchant in the World versus World area, and it'll cost you, I believe, 450 proofs of heroics to buy one of these, to buy a full set. All right, onto the build. So for the support Firebrand, as I said before, there's a couple of little variances. There's some things that you can kind of put on to kind of make up for maybe a lack of boon uptime, as well as a couple of things that are modified based on which weapons you're using. But by and large, this is a pretty good overview of what most people are going to be running. So in almost all cases, if you're the only Firebrand in your subgroup, you want to be running Honor, Virtues, and Firebrand as your 3 trees. Starting off in Honor, this is the first kind of set of skills, or traits that you're going for, rather. In the Honor trait line, you have 2 options depending on which weapon type you're using. So if you are playing Mace, you have 2 options here. You can either go with Invigorated Bulwark, which reduces your Mace skill recharge, which can help with getting more Aegis out to your allies, getting more heals off to your allies, as well as it just gives an overall static increase to healing whenever you block. If you're playing Axe or Mace, you can also decide to go for Protective Reviver. And this helps for rezzing allies that are down. It speeds up the rezzing process, as well as it puts a shield around them, so it protects them and you from projectiles and knocks away people trying to stomp them. So it's a really strong trait. Because I play Axe, I go with this trait, but if you're going Mace, you have the option. For the next trait line, you want to be using Pure of Heart. Pure of Heart makes it that Aegis heals whenever it blocks an attack, Aegis applied by you. So this is really important because Firebrand doesn't have a ton of burst heal. And as I kind of mentioned before, they're not the primary healers, but this allows for a constant stream of heals, and is also supplemented by the heal skill of the Firebrand, which applies Aegis to you whenever you use it. So that's an extra little chunk of heal there. So it's a handy trait to have. You're going to be pumping out a lot of Aegis on this build, so very handy. You could go Honorable Staff, but I wouldn't recommend it. Most people don't because it doesn't give a lot of concentration. The recharge time is nice, but honestly, I find that the Staff recharges perfectly fine. It's normally enough for me to pre-stack, and once you get into melee fights, you're not going to be using Staff as frequently anymore. Finally, you have 2 options for your Grandmaster trait line, depending on what utility skills you're running, as well as personal preference. So you can either run Force of Will, which gives you more health, as well as increases your outgoing healing. So this is just a really strong trait overall. But if you're worried about stab uptime, or you're running a lot of shouts, you can also go with Pure Voice, just for that reduction in shout recharge and for the conversion. It's a pretty solid trait, but I prefer to go with Force of Will. Another thing to note on Firebrand, you are healing every single time you're dodging, and it's a pretty chunky heal as well, especially when you got the right buffs and stuff going on. That's like 1k healing per roll, which can be the difference for you and your teammates, especially since it hits 5 allies, so that's like 5,000 heal per dodge if you kind of factor it all together. So a really strong skill. In the Virtues trait line, you pretty much always want to be running Master of Consecrations if you have your build, like, kind of, you're playing the meta way. But you can technically go for Retaliatory Subconscious if you're not running a Consecration. I run a Consecration, and I'll talk about why I run a Consecration when we get on to the utility skills. We're also running Absolute Resolution. This is another one that you want to be running. There isn't really a better alternative, and The reason that we run this is because whenever you go into your Resolve tome, you'll see that it'll cleanse 3 conditions on you and 3 conditions on your allies. And it also buffs the strength of your Virtue of Resolve passive, which is useful for our Grandmaster trait, Battle Presence. Battle Presence, essentially what it does is it spreads your passive virtue healing onto all your allies as well. So essentially, this is a really strong, because as I said before, while Guardian isn't a primary healer, it just doesn't have a lot of burst healing potential, you're still playing Minstrels. You still give out a decent amount of heals, and over the duration of a fight, this can be a pretty substantial amount of healing. Plus, the endurance regeneration that's happening as well is also very useful. Finally, Firebrand. In the Firebrand line, you always want to be running Archivist of Whispers, because we want to have extra pages in our tomes. The reason for that is because a lot of the flow of combat and a lot of what commanders will be doing is based on how many pages of certain tomes their Firebrands have left. As you see, as we go into those skills, you'll see that Courage is a really, really strong tome, and it's almost essential if you're going to be pushing deep into an enemy Zerg or pushing into any hot position. You need your Firebrands to have Courage up, and having an extra 3 pages means you can push that much farther and hopefully end the fight quicker. In the next trait line, the second trait line of Firebrand, you have 2 options here. One of these I consider the kind of the easier to do option, whereas the other one is a little bit more advanced to use, but it really can maximize the potential of your subgroup. So, you have the option between Legendary Lore, which makes it that you passively give regen and protection whenever you're using your Resolve skills or your Courage skills when you're in tomes, which can be useful. Or you could run Stalwart Speed, which is what I run. And essentially what that does is every single time you grant Aegis or Stability and the internal cooldown is off, you're applying over 3 seconds of quickness to your subgroup, which is a lot. That can get off a lot of skills, a lot of bursts, and it really just increases the offensive power of your subgroup. Would recommend running this, but if you're really feeling uncomfortable, you can run Legendary Lore. It's not a big deal. It's just about learning Firebrand and getting comfortable enough with it that you eventually feel good running Stalwart Speed. Finally, in the last trait line, you want to be running Lore Master. This reduces the recharge on tomes, which, as I said before, are very important. They're very important for dictating the flow of the battlefield, as well as the passive virtues is also something that is an asset to you. You want to be able to get that passive healing off from your battle presence, even after you've used your Resolve. Okay, so that's the traits, and that is the gear. Now we're going to go on to all the skills. Give everybody an overview of what skills are important and which ones just aren't worth your time to use. So, we'll start off with Staff. The Staff is probably the most important weapon set on Firebrand. You're going to be using this. It's your primary heal source in a lot of cases, and it's also your primary buffing source. So whenever a commander says to buff, you want to be on Staff. The auto attack on Staff isn't really useful to you as a Minstrel Firebrand. It's not going to do a lot of damage. You want to be staying off it as much as possible, but if you have nothing else to use, you got nothing else to use. Staff 2, 3, and 4 are probably the most frequently used skills on this set. And then 5 is kind of situationally useful. So, Staff 2 has 2 functions for you. Holy Strike. The first function it has is that it pulses heals. So what happens is, in that small span where Holy Strike is casting, there is 4 pulses of healing going on. And it's a pretty rapid heal. You can use this to heal allies who are trying to get back to you. You can use it on yourself to heal you and nearby allies. It's a good little healing source. It also functions as a blast finisher, and that's important because you'll be using, you want to be on staff, not only for stacking boons, but also for stacking stealth. So any single time your commander says, hey, let's go and stack, like on this tree up here, for example, and we're going to put down gyros in 3, 2, 1. You're blasting on that, and you're going to help contribute to the stealth uptime of your group for that blast. The next skill that we're looking at is Symbol of Swiftness. Now, Symbol of Swiftness has two functions, again. It constantly damages in its symbol area, as well as it constantly adds swiftness. So what you want to do is you always want to cast this first whenever you're stacking, so that way you can get off all the pulses of swiftness on your group. The other important thing to note with Symbol of Swiftness is that it's a light field. In some scenarios, this isn't a big deal, but if your group is going to stack stealth, for example, where you're waiting for the smoke field of a scrapper to come up and then you're blasting it, if you throw on this light field, then that will negate that. And anybody that blasts in that area will instead be blasting condition cleanses, which in some scenarios is useful, but when you're trying to stack stealth, it's just kind of a pain in the butt. So whenever you're stealth stacking, don't use this. Otherwise, use this pretty frequently. Because this is a blast, because Staff 2 is a blast and Staff 3 is a light field, you can also, as a quick little Condi cleanse, put down your blast, or put down your symbol and then blast it for condition cleanses as well for you and nearby allies. The next skill on Staff, that is probably the one you will be using the most frequently, is Empower. Empower has two functions again. One function is for healing purposes. It'll heal you and nearby allies once every pulse for 3 pulses, and then there will be a final pulse that'll pulse for a lot of healing. This will get off anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 healing for each member of your subgroup, and is a really, really potent skill. And it's also super important for pre-stacking light any single time you're about to go into an engage. It's important to note that this skill keeps you rooted to the ground, so you want to be using it wherever all your Zerg is going to be static for a little bit. You don't want to be using it necessarily as you're running in to engage with an enemy. So, to give you an example of the two types of stacks you will be doing most frequently on Firebrand, I'll first do a non-stealth stack, and then I'll do a stealth stack. So, in the case of a non-stealth stack, you want to put your Symbol of Swiftness up, run into it, and then Empower. Symbol of Swiftness, run into it, Empower. There's your might. Got over 20 seconds of swiftness. You're good to go. If instead we have stealth that's about to happen, we would instead wait for the mark. Commander says, hey, we're going to have stealth behind that tree. You're going to run to it. You're going to empower. And then as soon as those gyros are up, you're going to blast. And that's it. Not going to worry about swiftness. You can let somebody else worry about it. Final skill on Staff that's important is Staff 5, Line of Warding. This skill is a bit more situational, but can be useful for isolating enemies. Essentially what Line of Warding does is it puts a line on the ground that stops enemy movement going back and forth through it, provided those people do not have stability. So if you have a bunch of stragglers in the back of a Zerg, your commander might say, hey, put lines in the middle of them, and you might be able to isolate the pugs that don't have stability, or that have gotten their stability stripped, and they'll get interrupted and they'll be isolated from their group. Sometimes people will put these down in chokes as well. It's just it's another pressure tool, another zoning tool. On your second weapon set, your shield set that will have either mace or axe, this is your melee engage set. The purpose of this set is to be used whenever you're going into melee combat, whenever you're going for a hard push, because this has a lot of defensive options associated with it, as well as it has better cleave than your staff. So I'm going to go over the axe variant. The mace variant's pretty straightforward. Pretty much just mace 2 is going to be healing on your feet, and mace 3 is a block that will also give Aegis to all your allies, which means that that's extra Aegis, that means extra heals, extra blocks. It has a lot of synergy with this build. I go for the axe variant, and as I said before, that's the more offensive variant, and that's because of two skills on it. Axe 2 and Axe 3. Axe 2 is a cleaving skill. It puts a symbol down on the ground, which cleaves enemies inside of it, as well as it gives fury to you and your allies. So, if I'm going forward and I'm engaging, maybe I got some downs on my feet and we're staying here for a second, this will cleave them up and give fury to anybody in that area. Your other important skill on Axe is Axe 3. Whenever your commander calls for pulls, if you're on your melee build and you're not in a tome, you should be going for Axe 3. Pulling guys towards your allies and yourself to get them isolated from their Zerg. It has a pretty it's a pretty useful skill. You'll be using it quite a bit if you're playing the Axe variant. Your last two skills, your shield skills, are important for engages and moving around the battlefield. Generally speaking, you want to be casting Shield of Judgment on your subgroup, your allies, whenever you're about to go into that first initial engage. Gives Aegis, protection, and because of the fact that it gives Aegis, it also is going to give a little bit of quickness if it's the first skill you use because of that stalwart speed. And then Shield 5. Shield 5 is a great movement skill. You want to be using it super frequently because it protects you and your allies from projectiles. It's a channel skill, which means you can also use mantras as you're doing it. So while you're channeling that skill, you can pop mantras. And the last thing about the Shield 5 skill is you want to be using it again right as it's about to end. That'll end the shield effect, but it'll have a little bit of a burst heal on your group, which can be very handy. So, for example, I might be pushing in, popping my mantras, and then finishing off that Shield 5 manually. Alright, on to the utility skills. The utility skills you want to be running on Firebrand are pretty consistent across the board. I know some people like to run shout brands and other variants. This is the meta variant, but I also understand there's other ones out here, but this is what people run for the most part. So you're going to be running 3 mantras on this build. Mantra of Solace, Mantra of Lore, and Mantra of Liberation, as well as 2 other skills. You're going to be running Stand Your Ground always on this build. Stand Your Ground might be the strongest and most important skill on this build. So you want to always be running that. However, your last slot is a little bit more variable. Some people might slot in another shout for this, especially if they're running the Pure Voice variant. But for me and for a lot of others that are running the Masters of Consecration trait, you're going to put a Consecration in the slot. You have 3 options that I would consider viable, but I would definitely say Hallowed Ground is the strongest, especially with the upcoming changes to Retaliation that'll make it so it's pretty much like protection against condition damage. The reason we run Hallowed Ground generally is because of the fact that it pulses stability, so you can put it down anywhere for you and your allies as you're running through it. It'll keep stability up and running. It can stack pretty high too if you're running full minstrel armor like me with durability. And it's also useful if you know you're going to be going into, say, a tome that doesn't give stability. It's sometimes a good idea to pop one of these 2 skills before you go into it. So that way you can hope that you have enough stability to keep your allies topped up while you're healing them, for example. As for your 3 mantra skills, you pretty much want to be using them as they become useful. So, Mantra of Solace is a small heal, but it also gives you and your allies Aegis, which, because of our traits, will heal whenever it blocks an attack. As well as, because of the fact that it gives Aegis, it'll also give quickness if you're running stalwart speed like me. Your other 2 mantras, Mantra of Lore, is a Condi Cleanse. It gives a regeneration and also gets rid of a condition, or 2 conditions rather. And your final mantra is Mantra of Liberation. Mantra of Liberation, while it gives stability, I wouldn't use that as its primary purpose. Its strongest purpose is the fact that it breaks stuns. So what it does is it breaks stuns not just for you, but for allies as well. So let's say you're running away, you have a Zerg behind you, for example. and let's say some of your allies get stuck in, say, a gravel or something, you can turn, cast this on them because it casts in a cone, and it'll break their stuns, and you can keep moving again. So, very handy in that regard. Okay, so a couple of rules, just working off of these before going into tomes. Things to consider. As a general rule, make sure you're stacking before combat. Just be on staff to begin with. When you're pushing in for any sort of engage, when your commander says, hey, we're pushing in, we're engaging, the first super important skill to get off is make sure that as soon as you're about to engage, or as soon as you're within range of your enemies where they can start pulling, pop stand your ground first. It's your most important skill to get off first. If you do that, you've already done 70% of your job right there. After that, you want to see how many other kind of buffs you can kind of get off before that engage. So, whenever you're about to engage, you want to be on your melee set, your shield set, and you want to be popping stand your ground, shield 4, and then pushing in on shield 5 to block projectiles. So for example, let's say we're doing a non-stealth stack right here on this tree. I'd go Swiftness, Empower,
Might and glory.
Swap to my melee set, stand your ground, shield 4, up into shield like this, up into shield of absorption. That's a super solid push. You have a good chunk of buffs on you, and that'll at least get you set up for that first little engage. Now, if we were just considering stand your ground, our elite skill, and hollowed ground, we wouldn't really be able to keep up enough stab up time to really fight through everything. And that's why Tome of Courage is super important. Now, I know for a lot of new players, tomes are kind of overwhelming because, you know, they're tacking on an extra 5 skills for each that you need to learn, and some of them look very similar. So that's why I'm going to go over them all right now. For new Firebrands, I wouldn't worry too much about Tome of Justice. It's offensive, and it isn't really your primary responsibility. It's useful, but I wouldn't worry about it. It's not something you need to know super well. So I'm going to start on the other two, and then I'll touch on Justice at the end. First, I'll start with our most potent tome, Tome of Courage. As you can see, this tome, even with a reduced recharge, has a very long cooldown. This means that you want to be maximizing the potency of each page. You don't want to be just spamming random skills. You want to be using ones that are actually going to benefit your subgroup and keep everybody alive, because you want to get as far as possible forward with this, or as far as possible back, depending on when you're being called to use it. And most commanders will call Courage, but they might not. And if they don't, then you know you want to be using it as soon as your other buffs are starting to wear off. So for example, if I pop Stand Your Ground,
Stand your ground.
And I know I'm going to run out of stability soon, I might want to get into Courage right before it ends and start casting skills that give stability. So, I'm going to go into Tome of Courage now. You have 5 skills on Tome of Courage. It's of weapon skills. However, there's only 3 you need to worry about. These first 2 aren't supremely useful. The amount of stability that one gives is not very substantial. And the taunt from 2 is situationally useful. Sometimes if I have somebody that's rezzing their ally on the other team, I might be able to interrupt them with this, but it's not the primary responsibility. Let somebody else with poles deal with it, or Firebrands that are still using axe or something. These last 3 skills, 3, 4, and 5, are super important on Courage. These are the ones you want to be prioritizing at all times. When you go into Courage, the first thing you always want to use is Tome 5. The reason that we use Tome 5 is because it is extremely strong from a defensive standpoint. As you can see, looking over the tooltip, when you cast a skill, everybody in a wide radius that's part of your subgroup will get 200 toughness and then about 7 seconds worth of protection and stability, which is super strong by itself, as well as Aegis, which, because of how we're traded, again, gives a little bit of extra heals. This is a really strong skill. And whenever your stability is about to go down, if you're in Courage, you want to be popping this. So normally what's going to happen is you're going to pop this right when you get in. You're going to rotate through some other skills and then come back to use this again. Your other two skills, 3 and 4, are both useful, but for different things. Tome 4 acts as a stun break, but its primary reason why you're using it is because it pulses resistance. Resistance is super important. Right now, as of the recording of this, it resists all conditions. But after we get the patch in about a week's time, this skill is still going to be important because it ignores all non-damaging conditions. So that's blindness, that's chill, that's crippled, that's immobilize. All of those things will be ignored if you have resistance. So you want to be keeping up resistance on your allies so that way they can move freely about the battlefield and not be hindered in any way. Your last skill, Valiant Bulwark, your 3, is important because it's used for reflecting missiles. So you can use this partially to push. You might have a lot of Firebrands that'll kind of turtle these as they're pushing forward. Or you might use the one in front of you to block projectiles if you're staying in a single spot for a while. So if I'm pushing forward with this, say I've already used my standard round, I've used my other buffs. We've had our commander say, go into Courage. 5. For the extra stability. Resisting, blocking. Now, those are the only 3 skills you got to worry about. And then as soon as these come off cooldown, if you're in a space where it's still hot, you want to pop those again. Because of the long cooldown time, if your commander tells you to pull off of an area and you still have enough buffs, if they say, hey, we're pulling back, if you still have quite a few pages left, stay in it. Just stay in Courage. There's no point in coming back out, because honestly, you're probably better off, even if you're not going to be doing anything intense for a little bit. It's better to get off these skills next time you engage and then swap back into your normal weapons after that. So you normally want to be cycling through all 3 of these, with 5 always being the first one, and then you can choose after that. When you get to your last 2, you can just go 5 again, and then choose whichever one you want. I normally do Reflect. So that is your Courage Tome. You'll see that you'll have a lot of conditions on you sometimes, but as long as you keep up the resistance, you're fine, because hopefully other people in your subgroup will be able to cleanse all those conditions. Ideally they will, or they'll just wear out after the resistance is gone. So if you have a lot of conditions on you, don't freak out. If there's tons and they're starting to take damage, you can use your Mantra of Lore. You have it there for a reason. But it's not your primary responsibility. As an additional note for your mantras, whenever you're using them, you want to avoid using the last charge when possible. The reason for this is because while these are very potent and very strong, they will put your entire mantra on cooldown for a long period of time, and you'll have to recast it. In about a week's time, that won't matter anymore because they will become an ammo skill, at which point you can kind of just spam them, but I would at least recommend having one available in case you need to panic at some point and you need to spam off a whole bunch of mantras. Coming back to a little bit into the condition cleanse and whatnot, especially if you're lacking a healer in your subgroup, you might want to change Hollowed Ground for your other kind of most viable option, Purging Flames. This skill puts a burn ring on the ground, but the reason you're using it is because it cleanses conditions. It pulse cleanses conditions in a field for you and nearby allies. I think it's like 8 pulses, so it's a pretty strong commie cleanse overall. 2 more tomes to go through. The next tome we're going to talk about is Resolve. Resolve, while not as quickly important, it is important in the sense that you want to be using this whenever your commander is saying we need big heals or big cleanses on a spot. The reason for this is partly because it's the strongest heal on your build. It's the strongest burst heal you can get off. But also because it helps facilitate healing from your other healers. So when you enter Resolve, because of how we're traded, you're immediately going to cleanse 3 conditions on you and your allies whenever you go into it. So if you have a big condition bomb coming, might be a good time to go into Resolve. So you'll cleanse those 3 conditions, and the first skill you want to get off, similar to Courage, is you want to get off 5 first. The reason for it, though, is slightly different. This skill functions in two ways. One, it converts conditions on you into boons. Two, and it's for you and another additional ally. So it's pretty strong for helping you manage conditions. But it also has an additional benefit that it gives you 8 seconds of bonus healing if you're staying within the Oasis area. So this is really important because having 20% extra healing effectiveness can make a big difference in some fights, and it'll maximize the healing from your other skills on this tome. Your next thing that you want to get off, kind of in a similar manner again to Courage, is 4 most of the time. So you want to be casting 5, and you want to be casting 4, and 4 puts a big water field around you that will constantly heal and give swiftness. The healing that it gives is pretty substantial. It can be anywhere from 3 to 5,000, and when you factor in on top of that the additional 20% you're getting because of your 5, it's a pretty chunky heal. It's very useful. Tome 3, you kind of want to ignore. It's not as useful as it is on Courage. It gives a couple of buffs, but those can be ripped very easily. So you instead want to be focusing on these last 2 skills afterwards. So you want to go 5, 4, and then if you need more heals after that, you have 2 and 1. 2 gives slightly more healing if you have extra conditions on you in comparison to 1. So 2 is weaker, but then is strong. It's weaker than 1, but it's stronger than 1 if you still have conditions on you. You can see that it says per removed condition, and it removes 1 condition. This skill also functions by... it has a bit of a longer cast time. So you don't want to be spamming this one because you just won't be able to. But you can spam 1. So normally if you're doing a heal burst on the skill, on Resolve, you want to be doing 5 for the extra bonus healing. 4 because it's the strongest heal. Then you might want to do 1, 2, like a single cast of 2. And then you want to spam 1. If you feel that you don't need the extra heals, you might want to save off. And if this comes back off cooldown, you might want to use 5 and 4 again. It just comes down to how the fight's looking. But these are definitely your 2 priority skills, and then you transfer into these last 2. So, 5, 4. Maybe we still have conditions. I'll go 2, and then I'll start spamming 1 for extra heals. As you can see, we're already got 5 back up, so I might just do this again. And that's extra heals on this spot. Super potent. If you combine that then with Staff 2 and Empower, you can pump out a lot of heals, despite not being the primary healer. So it's still very useful in that regard. As a final note on tomes, Justice. Justice won't see as much use in play, but it can be useful if you're trying to secure kills when the enemy is running or grinding up downs.
History is mine.
This is not required homework per se, but I do want to go over the skills to prioritize on this if you are using it. 5, 4, and 3 again, just like Courage. These skills have different functions though. You don't need to prioritize 5 here. This is just a good buff. When you use it, it gives it to nearby allies, and it just means that their next few attacks do burning damage, which can be a good cover condition, and honestly, it stacks up pretty fiercely, so it can actually make the difference when you're trying to kill enemies. 4 is a skill that's used when you're wanting to grind up downs, or keep a place like extra high, if you're going for a bomb and you don't need the extra sustain. It pulses damage and burns around you. So if you have a lot of downs around you, you can use this to secure downs. And your final skill to look at is your 3, which is a pull. What happens is anything within that anything within that green circle is going to get pulled towards the center. Great for bombing, great for interrupting skills, and is just useful for keeping enemies locked in place while your damage dealers get to work. Don't feel pressured to use all of the skills on this. This is just kind of a little bit of a situational tome to use. Alright, with that, I've gone through pretty much all of the basics of Support Firebrand. But I just want to kind of do a quick recap of a couple of the rotations to look at, as well as a couple of little theoretical things, so I'll just go over them super quickly. Let's say we're stealth stacking here. Empowering.
Armed and ready.
Blasting. Or stealth now. Big stab.
Stand your ground.
Swapping in the shield. Shield 4. 5. This is your pushing rotation. You might be staying here for a bit. You might be sustaining for a little while. Let's say you are getting hit by a lot of damage, but you're staying on the spot. You might want to put down Hollowed Ground and go into Resolve. Spam the heals here. 5, 4, 2, and spamming 1. And your commander might say, we're going to push now. You might go back into Big Stab. Might go back into Shield for a melee engage. Or you might pop Courage if you're going for a big push. Remember, 5 for stability, 4 for resist, 3 for reflex. And you can kind of keep that going. These last quite a while. Alright, so with that, I don't think I have anything else that needs to be covered currently. So, I hope you guys got some information out of this video. Feel free to message me in Discord if you have any other questions, or talk to me in game or talk to me in voice. I'm around pretty frequently. Have a good one.